Making money as a solo player has been getting harder and harder, especially over the past year. So I've been trying to explore ways that a solo player can make a good amount of money without relying on just full loot PvP, killing other people and taking their stuff, because that isn't honestly that available or achievable for everybody. So in this video, I explored soloing static dungeons. Now I've done this before. Tier 7 static dungeons used to be really good for a solo player to do, but since then obviously SBI has made them a lot more challenging, nerfed the sort of soloing those dungeons a lot more, so it's a lot harder to do and a lot less reward. But Morgana statics, the ones that are tier 6 and tier 8, are actually still very easy to do and very good for rewards. So just quickly starting with the basics, what makes these Morgana statics so good is that there are 5 chests guarded by boss mobs that are very easy to clear without having to clear very many other mobs. And of course, along with that, the bosses are relatively easy to solo. So in total, there are 8 of these large chests with bosses attached to them, 7 of which are on the main floor of the dungeon, which you can see in these locations, and then there is 1 in the corner of the bottom floor here. Scattered throughout these floors are also smaller chests that are guarded not by bosses but just random mob groups. I'm not too sure how the rewards compare from the small chests to the big chests. They seem pretty similar. Usually it seems like the big ones have a little bit more loot in them, but they're not that much difference. The main difference between them is that these smaller chests guarded by the mob groups are actually a lot harder to clear as a solo player, so you want to mainly be going for the big chests guarded by the bosses. Now, the reason that these aren't actually too bad to solo, actually fairly easy in a lot of cases, there's 2 reasons. One is that there's really not that many mobs attached to the chest. Like, you don't have to clear the room. There's really just the boss and then usually either like no or like 1 or 2 other mobs attached to the chest. So you really don't have to clear that many mobs. And more importantly, the mobs in these Morgana dungeons are bugged. Maybe, I'm not too sure if it's intentional or not, but basically it's quite easy to pull only 1 or a couple of the mobs in a mob group rather than the mob group itself. You're usually only supposed to be able to pull the entire mob group at once, but it's actually quite easy in these dungeons to manipulate it to only pull 1 or a couple. I'll get into exactly how you do this after we cover the build. Looking at our build now, this is not too difficult of an activity, so you don't actually need a super specific build to make this work. Really, any of these sort of solo static, solo group stuff builds that have worked are probably going to work. So Shadow Caller, Nature's, One-Handed Dagger, maybe even Battle Axe, they should all work. However, Nature is the best. For the weapon, I prefer Druidic Staff, although the Iron Root and the One-Handed Nature also work very well. You can use those if you prefer them instead. For shoes, this is really the only slot that you don't really have much customization in. You basically need to run Shoes of Tenacity for doing the solo static stuff. Unfortunately, they're very expensive, but the low cooldown stealth is just so important. It's everything in these static dungeons where there's mobs everywhere that will do so much damage to you. You can reset mobs every like 10 seconds. It is a huge lifesaver and just saves so much time, makes things so much easier. I would highly suggest investing in the Shoes of Tenacity. We're also going to be using the Shoes of Tenacity specifically to manipulate the mob pulls to only get 1 or 2. You can use other stuff for it, but the Shoes of Tenacity, again, are by far the easiest for it. The biggest decision to make in the build is probably in the chest piece, so really you have sort of 2 options. One is you can go a cloth robe, cultist robe, specifically for more damage. This will help you clear faster, you just have more damage with that natural cloth robe. However, it does make things a little bit harder as you have less healing and less defensive than the leather options, which we'll get into in a second. So if you're going a little bit lower IP or a little bit more new to this, you want a little bit more buffer room, I would suggest going with the leather options, which are the Mercenary Jacket or the Hellion Jacket. These give you more defensiveness and more healing, so it makes the fights easier. However, again, they are less damage than the cultist robe, so it'll take you a little bit longer. For your offhand, really, Torch is always good for that attack speed and cooldown reduction. Otherwise, Mist Caller is the one I like using for just more cooldown reduction, get those healing spells up faster. Offhand isn't super important though, you can always go like a shield or something too if you want to. For helmet, in these clips I was using soldier helmet, trying it out. It wasn't the best in these dungeons specifically because there's not all that much you need to iframe with the soldier helmet, although it is still quite good, especially for the melee bosses. However, some general good options are things like the Spectre hood and the Assassin hood. For your cape, the Undead cape is super nice for being safe in these dungeons. We'll talk about this in a second, but it's pretty dangerous in these dungeons, and the Undead cape gives you that nice buffer of safety. The automatic invis when you get low HP is a massive lifesaver. However, if you're doing a hard pull and you're gonna get under 30% HP from the mobs, it will reset them and it's really annoying. So in my opinion, the best thing to do is actually to bring an Undead cape and equip it for most of the time. But if you're ever doing a hard boss or hard pull, switch to a demon cape so you don't get that accidental reset when things get tough, and you get the extra damage from the demon cape. For potions, we can say a very similar thing as we said for the capes. Invis potions make you a lot safer. They're super nice. I would highly suggest bringing them and equipping them most of the time. Although if you're on a particularly hard boss, having some poisons in your back pocket can help. Lastly, for food, you have a couple options. Roasts help you lifesteal up a lot, and omelets help you get your cooldowns back faster. Both are really good. If you are finding things to be pretty easy, you can also go stews just to speed things up and get more damage. So moving on to look at our strategy, basically how you actually go ahead and do this. The best way, in my opinion, is sort of to roam around to all the boss spawns and see if they're up and then do those first, as they're just so much easier, quicker, and honestly more rewarding than the smaller chests. There are some smaller chests in particular you can go for, although most of them I would completely ignore. These ones in sort of like the middle of the bottom floor and the middle here and the top floor, these ones aren't too bad. They only have like 4 or 5 mobs guarding them, so they're not too bad, but some of the other ones are just like truly difficult to go for, so I don't even bother going for them. Once you have a boss or a chest picked out that you're going for, you want to look at the group of mobs that's sort of guarding the chest. You should be able to figure it out just by looking at it, although attacking it a couple times you're able to figure it out pretty easily. And the biggest thing is to make sure that you're separating the pulls into a one or a couple mobs. So this is actually really easy to do in these dungeons because again, it's bugged or something. So step 1 is just to aggro the mob group. So just hit them with an auto attack or something, and this will make it so that all of the mobs in that group are gonna come chasing you and trying to attack you. That sets you up for step 2, which is to de-aggro the mob group a little bit away, at least a little bit away from where they originally were. The easiest way to do this is just to take a couple steps back and then pop your Shoes of Tenacity going into that stealth, and it will automatically de-aggro all of the mobs. The mobs will then become immune and walk back to their original locations where you aggroed them from. And so you can do step 3, which is to attack one of the mobs that is in the process of running back right as they're about to get back to their starting location. I'm not going to get into all the rules of aggro and how it works here, but basically what you want is to attack one of the mobs that's immune running back a while another mob in that mob group has already gone back to its starting location. This is slightly buggy, it won't work 100% of the time, but if you keep doing it, you should eventually be able to get at least like 1 or 2 mobs on their own. One thing to watch out for here is the Morgana mages that spawn the bats. You want to make sure you're de-aggroing before they spawn the bats, because the bats are a little bit weird and they kind of mess everything up. So you want to just make sure there are no bats spawn while you're trying to do this, or it will really mess things up. One other tip, some of the rooms have like roaming boss mobs. If you ever want to aggro only the mobs that are still guarding the chest, you can just walk up to the chest and try to click on it and try to open it even if it's still closed. And what will happen, it will say there are still mobs guarding this chest, and all of the mobs that are actively guarding that chest that are attached to it will go and try to aggro you. So you can not only use that to see which mobs are guarding it, but you can also use that if like the boss is roaming around into another group of mobs and he's the only thing left you have to kill, you can just walk up to the chest and aggro only the boss by pressing on that chest rather than trying to work around that other group of mobs. One other note for your strategy here is you want to have what to do in mind in case somebody shows up at the edge of your screen. So doing these bosses and chests isn't too hard if everything's just going good and you're having at it, but if somebody comes and tries to mess with you, like it's very easy to kill you if you are just trying to like de-aggro the boss and not aggro all the other stuff in the room while you're getting bopped around by a rat and a group's coming to kill you. Like things can get very dangerous very, very quickly. So you want to make sure you have a plan in mind. If you see a rat or if you see a group, are you going to try to finish the boss and just ignore them, or are you going to run away? My strategy was just to leave every time. If there was someone there, I would just leave. Looking at the rewards for soloing static dungeons, they mark on at tier 6s and tier 8s. How good is it? Well, the answer to that question is way more complicated than it should be because it's so volatile. There's so many factors that go into how valuable this is to do as an activity. So the main one is how busy is the dungeon? Are the bosses up? Are they down? Is there groups clearing all over the place? If there's tons of other people in the dungeon, it's going to be pretty bad, but if you have a dungeon to yourself, it's crazy good. You can go through all 5 bosses by yourself in less than 30 minutes. So because of this, I would sort of suggest against doing this at like prime time, that's sort of like 20 UTC when both NA and EU are on. It's probably going to be a little bit too busy to really effectively solo static dungeons, but if you're somebody that plays on the less busy times, then it could be really good for you because the dungeons could be completely empty. Now, the rewards also depend on things like how upgraded the bosses are, if you're finding yellows or oranges or reds, how good is your gear, like what tier, what kind of gear are you using, are you doing tier 6 dungeons versus tier 8 dungeons? All of these things are going to affect how good the rewards from these dungeons are. So because of that, I can't really give you how much fame or money per hour you're going to get on average doing this because it's just, there's so many factors. What I can give you though is sort of what I experienced. So here's some like numbers for reference. A tier 6 yellow boss will give you around 100k fame, around 150 to 200 might, and around 50 favor. An orange boss of tier 6 will give around 300 to 350k fame, 500 might, 150 favor. Didn't see any red bosses while I was doing this, but I imagine again they're much higher than even the orange ones. And in terms of sort of averages from when I was doing this, I was usually seeing at the minimum around 1 million fame per hour and around 4k might or 1k favor per hour at the low end. At the high end, it was at least double that. For money, I didn't really see any great chests. I mean, I didn't come across any red bosses, so the rarity of chests was never super high. Most of the chests were green and not that great, usually giving around 50 to maybe 100k worth of loot. This may sound really bad, but it's actually pretty good. Most of the chests really don't take too long to do, and you can occasionally get much better loot. For example, compare this to doing solo dungeons. In the static dungeon, you have like 10 plus chests in that one dungeon that you know the locations of, and you can just go there and do those chests. In a solo dungeon, you go in, you don't know how many chests there's going to be. There's usually like 2 or 3, and they take much longer to do because you have to clear the entire floor up to those chests. So the amount of chests that you're getting when you're soloing static dungeons is so much higher than with sort of any other content. So even though the individual chest loot usually isn't very good, combined, since you're opening so many on average compared to other sorts of content, and honestly the chests are usually better than other sorts of content, it does add up to quite a lot of money. In my testing, I don't think I ever once left with under 1 million worth of silver in my inventory from the chests, and the trips were usually 1 hour or less. On the best trip, I was literally in and out in 10 minutes, did 2 chests, and completely filled my inventory with like 3 mil of loot. So overall, soloing Morgana static dungeons is a very good activity for a solo player to do, in my opinion. It is definitely high risk, but it is also high reward. It is a good way to make money as a solo player. It's probably a little bit worse than soloing statics used to be, like the tier 7 undead ones, but if you can find a low populated static, you can expect some pretty crazy rewards for the time you put in.